Welcome to Acclaim Conversations, where we talk to the business people that matter in Vietnam. Today, I'm interviewing here Dr. Burkhard Schrage, who is the Senior Program Manager for MBA, Executive MBA, the Business Program, and he's a Senior Lecturer at RMIT University Vietnam, and Business Entrepreneur at Large, and we'll also learn a bit about that. Burkhard, welcome to today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great to talk to you. Now, you've been in Vietnam around about 10 years, but you've lived in many places. You've been an investment banker, academia, you've been in private practice, you've done research programs. I'd love to hear a bit about your background, what brought you here, and what's led you to where you are today. So tell us a bit about your background and how you came here.
Yeah, great question. I get that a lot because it's sort of a non-linear way, right? It's like I'm German. I was born and raised in Germany. After my undergraduate studies, I continued my studies in France, became an investment banker there, and I worked mainly on privatization programs. That was the way, time when France privatized all the state-owned companies, everything they had, So after a while, I thought, it's like investment banking, there's a glass ceiling, right? So then you have to go off and do an MBA. I decided to actually do a master's degree, not an MBA, but kind of a joint degree, partly business and partly politics in the United States. And then I went from there to Brazil because I sort of developed an interest for emerging markets during my studies. Like, what is different in emerging markets other than they tend to be poor, right? But how do transactions actually happen in emerging markets? What's the ownership structure in emerging markets? So I developed that interest in Brazil, had also a large privatization program. Then I worked in investment banks in Brazil. After that, I've had some interesting phenomena that happened during my time in Brazil. The communist president Lula was elected for the first time president, and the financial markets tanked. And I was wondering whether there is actually a relationship between, partisanship of presidents and financial market performance. So I went back to study this as a PhD. And after you have done a PhD, your most likely option is to go to academia. So I went to Singapore, which is a great vantage point for emerging markets research, right? So I went to Singapore. After about 10 years doing that, I thought I wanted to get my hands dirty again, right? I went from Singapore. I came a lot to Vietnam, mainly for kite surfing. So more wind, more water in Vietnam, actually. And I met my wife then, and my future wife, and so I after 10 years in Singapore, I thought, okay, let's go to Vietnam. I think the impact that you can have is much larger in Vietnam than it was in Singapore.
So that's brought you here. Why RMIT? Where does that come into that sort of career and academia and that evolution to emerging markets in Vietnam? So you've narrowed it down, but why RMIT in particular?
Yeah, RMIT enables us academics, right, to do world-class research, world-class teaching, world-class facilities. You have seen them, and in the heart of a rapidly growing economy. So I think there's this ability to work in a world-class institution, but in the middle of the emerging of the economy, but also the changing societal structures. You feel it, right, when you're there. I think that's a unique position RMIT offers to academics in general, if you're interested in the phenomena that I'm interested in.
And I might go back to a bit more about RMIT specific, but let's look at the Greater Asian region and Vietnam, how it fits in higher education. So I was reading that there's around 7,000 higher education institutions across the Asian region. We've got about 12 million students. Vietnam's clearly important in number and size, but where does that fit in? Where is Vietnam in that scale of regional education? You said RMIT's got a fantastic, but as Vietnam as a whole, where does it fit, and where is the positioning for Vietnam?
Yeah, I think national education systems typically reflect sort of a country's reality, right? So they reflect the history, they reflect the future ambitions, as well as, for example, is there a large percentage of agriculture in agricultural sector? So it's hard to compare them regionally. What some of our visiting professors remark, and I think this is really interesting, is that students that either go to postgraduate studies or even undergraduate studies in Vietnam, they're really committed to the country. So we are not sort of an exporter of brains in Vietnam. Everybody is really sort of committed to sort of working and having an impact on Vietnam. In other countries, perhaps, I think, for example, the Malaysian system, people actually pursue postgraduate studies to sort of get out of that country and maybe make an impact somewhere else. And that's very different, I think, from our students that I see.
Well, just on that then, the postgraduate side of things, what does that do to Vietnam? Because we see different views, and I've seen quite a few students, and maybe I'm wrong and love to be educated here, do their graduate program and go straight to a postgraduate. They think it's a necessary part of their education. That may have changed in recent years. I've been here a while. Where does postgraduate education sit? Is it fulfilling some of the gaps of the graduate system? Has it evolved into something else, and it has a different influence on Vietnam's economic growth? Where is that at the moment?
Yeah, from our experience, we see both, I have to say, right? So we see where students sort of are still hungry after the undergraduate studies and say, like, I want to actually know more about business or finance, and they continue immediately with a postgraduate program. But we also see, sort of mid-level sort of managers, more and more, coming back to school, refreshing their knowledge or sort of upskilling sort of what they know about what they have learned maybe 10 years ago. So it's a mixed bag. I don't think we can sort of just say they're this way, sort of immediate from undergraduate, or they are just senior managers, like in the US, for example, where typically you do postgraduate, at least in business, after 5 to 10 years experience, right? So it's a mixed bag, which makes actually the classroom experience quite nice, because you have young students which are somehow unconstrained, right? They think, everything is possible. And then you have more experienced students who think everything is impossible. And that sort of gives a great discussion in a postgraduate classroom, right?
The hungry without experience and the experience with maybe less hunger to push themselves in some directions. Okay, that's sense. And the gaps, just to finish the discussion on the Vietnam system before we sort of look at RMIT, where are the biggest gaps do you see in the broad sense in Vietnamese education at the moment, and particularly postgraduate education? Where are the biggest gaps?
Yeah, I think this has been articulated from many sort of observers of Vietnam's economy, of the education system. One of the biggest gaps is actually soft skills. So leading teams, working in teams, for example. So I think the high school system is very individualistic, and there is no exposure to sort of working in teams. Presenting stuff, expressing ideas is something that we hear from our industry advisory board. It's absolutely what we have to build into our programs, right? Then there's, I think that's a big sort of gap that we try to address as well with our offerings. So the soft skills, sometimes critical analysis skills could be sharpened, I guess. Very good analytical skills, but sort of being critical, or even being able to sort of contradict sort of established wisdom.
Yeah, that rote learning element of Vietnamese education does hold people back in that.
That's right. And there's a huge respect, of course, to sort of the teaching, right? So the teaching sort of, they tend to be true, right? And I think in Western societies,
it's in Vietnamese society. Don't question your father. Don't question your boss. Don't question your teacher.
That's
you
right.
Just accept.
That's right. And actually, we try so what's wrong with what I just said, and why does this not work in Vietnam, right? And this is especially interesting because
is that for an A? Please tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah, actually, fundamentally, business is a social science, right? So we don't have a precise answer, unlike in the natural sciences, right, where 2 + 2 is 4. But should we acquire or not our competitor? We actually will never know the right answer. What was the right thing? Because we don't have two realities, right? And I think actually some of the students are sort of frustrated with this, that there is no right answer, right?
There's an analysis, but
there's a
potential conclusion, but it may not be an answer.
Exactly, it might not be the right
precise
answer.
Yeah.
And actually, so especially in postgraduate programs, we it lives through the contributions of all the students, right? So that sharing their experiences, and what we see in Asia in general, people, students don't like to volunteer their knowledge unless they know they're perfectly right. So it's hard sometimes to make them sort of share knowledge or even respond to questions and things like that.
You've touched on a few things there, and you're leaning into what makes RMIT different, and sort of back to my earlier question of why RMIT. I want to hear more about the RMIT difference, and particularly for what you look after the postgraduate programs in MBA and executive MBA particularly. What makes them different? Why? What's RMIT doing differently in Vietnam to the others? And I'm assuming others follow and observe and use that as a benchmark. But what's RMIT doing that does drive and make a change and impacts some of those things you've just talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. RMIT has been in country here for 23 years. And the interesting sort of story is that RMIT was founded by, I think, the Tradesman Union, the plumbers and
the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology.
Yes. That's what it became, but sort of the origin was really the tradesman.
It was a trade school.
That's right, and a trade school, and the motto until today is still a cultivated hand and an educated mind. Okay. That's our motto, and so there's sort of like two things, right? One is it means that we are very strong in technology. That's the T of RMIT is about technology. And also it means that we do a lot of applied stuff. So we do research, we care about theory, but we care about how does that work in real life, right? So how does the plumbing work, right? That's what really interests us. And I think that's a key difference from many Vietnamese universities who are very fixated on sort of here's a theory, but how the application works, not so much, right?
Sure.
So we do the opposite. We really care about the application, and we care a little bit less about the theory. I mean, we are all academics, but I think that's one of the big key differences. Like, if you care about how do we actually cook the sausage, right? Then I think RMIT and our impact, I think, is not only through the students, but through our faculty, where we invite a lot of sessional teachers, sort of teachers from other universities who come and see how we teach. We give a lot of teaching seminars, and they bring that back to their own universities.
And you also mix that with business lecturers from business as well. So that's an interesting. So you're quite happy to bring different people around and different viewpoints.
That's right. So we many times in very specialized sort of areas or very applied areas. Think about business data analytics, where we actually have to really run the machine somehow. Then we have people who actually practice this every day, right? And they come in, So we invite sort of industry experts, in particular, to plug certain gaps that we also have, right?
The expertise can be very narrow field. Expertise.
Could be a very, very exactly narrow field of expertise, and then we invite people from the industry with the academic sort of credentials that are required, Yeah, and they typically do an amazing job as well. So you know.
And you mentioned the facilities, and it's one thing that always impresses me when I've gone to the facilities in Ho Chi Minh City in particular, is that it is cutting edge. I wouldn't know the difference between which country I'm in, if I'm in a Western country, if I'm in Vietnam, from the university itself. That's relatively unique. There's not many universities, I'm guessing, in Vietnam that would have the same level of facilities in that point.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, so I think there was a huge investment, 23 years ago into the land, the building, and we're, as you probably know, but the money that we make, we cannot send it anywhere, right? So it has to be kept at RMIT Vietnam, and so we're financially, I think, able to actually sort of maintain and upkeep the facilities. And of course, it's not sort of just to show off, but I think it's really part of the learning. Sort of one ingredient is like, where do you learn? Do you have carpet? We have carpet in the classroom. Things like I care about.
Yeah.
We have carpet in the classroom that there is no reverberation. So many small things that might seem like, oh, hey, that's a bit luxury, but actually these are important sort of pedagogical sort of enriches the pedagogical experience,
yeah,
right?
the cultural experiences within the culture of the classroom itself.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're not much different from what you would see in Melbourne, in our sort of mothership. So actually the same.
It's the same degree.
It's the same degree. It's the same. We're reporting to the Australian regulator, to TEXA, which So absolutely the same. Everything is the same. We contextualize the materials. So when we talk about strategy, we talk about Vingroup or Vinamilk and so forth, and sort of extract sort of also what is different in Vietnam, right? So it's important, right? Because our mission is really to help our our key stakeholder is actually Vietnam, the country, right? It's not Melbourne.
Which then leads into how we develop business leaders in Vietnam and how RMIT contributes to that. Because you look at some of the areas you would personally look at is corporate governance, looking at business strategy, you're looking at the politics and economy and how it all feels together. How are we creating leaders? You're looking at quite areas that are critical for future businesses and the development of business. The leaders coming out of this, are we getting better out there? Is there enough coming out of the system? Does RMIT create the leaders that are leading change for the future and sort of helping the country move ahead?
That's clearly our hope, right? I think that's the key reason why we are there. We want to plug sort of this big demand on sort of middle management and top management.
And can you measure the impact you're having, or is it just too hard to do?
What we do surveys, for example, it's like how many job offers our students have after they graduate or when they graduate. So about 100% of our students get a job offer, at least one, and many get actually more than that, and that means there's demand, right? Yep. So I think we're responsive to the industry demands. And I always like to say to monique our RMIT as sort of like a dancing elephant, because we are very fast, very responsive, right? So we have sometimes programs in Vietnam that we roll out here before actually they roll them out in Melbourne. For example, digital marketing, right? So marketing became digital like 10 years ago or something like that. And we immediately had a digital marketing sort of program, and Melbourne still doesn't have it. Because, so we're actually in some ways, very fast, even though we are large, right? So it's 12,000. That's why it's an elephant somehow, right? 12,000 students. In Vietnam only.
But 2 campuses, or 3 campuses.
We have 3 campuses, right? In Hanoi and Saigon, and in Da Nang we teach English only. RMIT worldwide has about, I think, 100,000 students. So we are quite large, but we are agile, right? And I think we are a great example of sort of how, corporate agility in some ways right now.
Because if you look at education post-COVID or pre-COVID that led to post-COVID, the change in off campus, on campus, digitalized, the whole change. You've had to stay at the forefront of that personally.
Yeah.
And as a university, has that permeated through Vietnam? Is Vietnam agile in its education because of that as well? Is that help to the evolution in Vietnam education?
I really don't know, but I think it gave many people, so many observers, a taste of what probably is coming, right? So the infrastructure, Vietnam is a great sort of infrastructure in terms of internet, in terms of how many phones and tablets and computers people have per capita. So it's there, and I think for the broader Vietnam, it's probably not there yet. There need to be more to be done. We're actually doing a study right now, like digitizing public services, right? So why do people reject transacting with authorities on a digital platform and so forth? And how could we help sort of the decision makers to make the right decisions, that there's more digital transactions with governments, right? So there is actually a very basic layer, right? So people don't trust digital stuff, right? It can be altered. It can be, where does that go, right?
And Vietnam hasn't had a history of digitalized economy where in the West it's become digitized, completely digitized. In Vietnam, it's an evolution.
It's evolutionary. It's thoughtful, but it's not very fast, right? And in fact, we just recently sort of committed to Vietnam, announcing a very large sort of amount of money that will come to sort of like will come to Vietnam, building new facilities and growing even more. But with that also, we said number one mission is actually helping Vietnam in this trajectory towards a more digital economy. That means basically, going to the private sector and sort of supporting them with, white papers, with, sort of prescriptive research, like what should you do rather than what are you doing, what should you do and what can you do in your digital transformation journey, right?
And is AI going to change that? Is Vietnam embracing AI from an academic perspective, or is that too early to tell just yet? Because in business, it's the talk of business. We're not seeing it necessarily, but on the fringe, a lot of things are taking advantage. We're seeing the evolution. Where's AI coming into this?
Yeah, I've been recently at a conference and talking about exactly this question. The students for sure embrace it, right? For better or worse, right? Artificial intelligence, what it does help, and on a very low level, right, is simply doing a lesson plan. So give me a lesson plan. I will talk about brain drain versus brain gain. It gives you a fabulous lesson plan.
Here's your structure. Here's my starting point.
Yeah, exactly. And it will give you, so actually it does help the teaching faculty a lot. And I do think that many colleagues sort of like seek the support of that. And there's nothing wrong with that. We, again, at RMIT, we embrace, of course, we can't sort of like wish it away or something like that. It's there, and let's get support from that. What I think ultimately AI will be a very large benefit to Vietnam because it sort of narrows this sort of digital divide, right? So what is like, okay, there's this knowledge haves and knowledge have nots, right? So now, wherever you live in Vietnam, you have access to knowledge. You can formulate your questions really well on emails. You can write perfect emails, and I'm thinking of all these exporters who suddenly can correspond.
The language gaps and the grammar in your communication can disappear in written form now.
That's right, and so I think for Vietnam as sort of a country, I think this is really helpful. This is a very basic layer, sort of writing better emails, or just sort of making a better PowerPoint presentation and convincing your client why your product is better than that product. So
it's embracing. It's not rejecting. It's definitely embracing.
I don't know about the Vietnamese adoption of ChatGPT. I just see it. Our students certainly use it, but for now we allow them. For example, sometimes we ask them to use ChatGPT to kind of initiate for the ideation of a paper, for example.
Because you get out of it what you put in. It's not just give me an answer. So it's an interesting
exactly.
skill.
That's right. That's right. So we trust our students, So we say, okay, for the ideation, you use ChatGPT, go ahead. But for the execution, you do it, right? So there are others where we say, okay, you can't do it. So some exams where we say, okay, no ChatGPT allowed. We have, of course, all the tools sort of in place to sort of give us likelihoods of, ChatGPT having written an assessment or so.
Yeah. That's the modern age now. Academia itself in Vietnam, what's the progression? Is it something which is fairly, that's coming from that first, the previous question about AI. Is it fairly stuck in its ways? Is it evolving fast? Is there desire from the academia to grow and change? I'm just sort of curious to sort of where the drivers. You mentioned how your students want ChatGPT, and the younger generation in Vietnam is definitely wanting a lot and digitally connected. Academia.
Yeah. Vietnam is definitely one place where you could, if you would bet on Vietnam academia rising, you're right. If I looked recently at the academic publications of Vietnamese researchers, so like 30 years ago, there was very, very little in the academic literature. And as it turns out, the amount of academic papers in the world rises. The amount of academic papers in Asia rises faster than the world average. And the amount of academia rises faster than the Asian. So in Asia, Vietnam is now number one in terms of growth rates in the production of new knowledge, right? This is actually research, right?
From a low base, it's really going up.
From a low base, and it's not so low anymore because this has been a compounded sort of effect over the last 20 years. So for example, if I recall correctly, Vietnamese researcher now output more than Singapore. I mean, Singapore is 20 times smaller. I admit it, but still, I mean, people would think, wow, Singapore is sort of this hub of knowledge creation and all that. No, come to Vietnam, you will have the same amount of intellectual property being created. So it's a great. Vietnam is actually a great vantage point again, sort of to observe. Let me sort of rephrase that. I think being in Vietnam as an academic is really good because you're close to sort of fundamental sort of changes in society. So some interesting issues that academia has to lead on. For example, the aging issue in Vietnam. Vietnam is the fastest aging society in the world.
Yeah, as a young population, but it's fasting. And it's two extremes that other countries aren't facing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I always ask my students, so how many siblings does your mom have? The answer is 6 or 7. How many siblings do you have? The answer is 1, right? So that's one generation. So and that makes actually Vietnam the fastest aging society. This has its particular set of challenges, of course. So in terms of elder care, in terms of health care, in terms of sort of financing, old age.
And Vietnam's going to lean on a significant lean on productivity growth and productivity development in order to be able to deal with that aging population.
That's right. And so Vietnam has this imperative to sort of get away from sort of more manual labor to more sort of automated processes, right? Because that's one of the drivers. Sort of you have to rethink every factory and so forth. And actually, the USP of investing in Vietnam has to be rethought, right? It's not cheap labor. It's sort of smart, sort of semi-skilled, skilled labor. That's why you want to come, right?
Well, you're leading me into another question, which is outside the academic world, you've actually you've got a frontier investment fund looking at opportunities in other markets. It's quite something quite different, but connected to what you do in the academic world. Tell us a bit about what you do and some of the other investments and some of the activities and the thought process behind them, because it's really interesting watching someone that has come from investment banking through the different worlds and look at things different ways, but has that emerging market background in very different continents. How does that drive your investment process, and what do you look for, and how do you do that as a side project?
It's more like a side project. It's a small sort of family fund, if you want, family. So what we look for is some kind of innovation that applies, that sort of takes advantage of either Vietnam or the region of its strength. A good example is one investment in a company that makes that makes protein out of insects, from insects. We relocated to this company to Malaysia.
From
Vietnam. So this is it's actually interesting. So the two founders, so there is a fly, it's called the black soldier fly, that actually is ideal for this, because the larvae get relatively fast big. And this is what you use for the protein, right? And the larvae, this black soldier fly is native to Vietnam and native to other countries around the equator. But so they came here. They've literally caught their first black soldier fly on the premises of the agricultural university. And that became, sort of they lay eggs, like one larva. I think they lay about 2,000 eggs per live, and so you multiply easily. You have a stock, and so this is something you could not do, I think, in Europe easily. Now they ideally grow and an average temperature of 27 degrees and so forth. So this is fairly manual. You can't automate that, so you need to have sort of semi-skilled labor for that. And so this and that has a huge impact, right? So this is actually, this is like a circular, because the larvae are getting fed with the organic waste of other sort of industrial processes. So we buy waste, if you want, and we use that to make very high-end protein for animal feed or pet food. So it addresses many issues. It addresses
impact investment. It's covering a lot of things. Inadvertently, but it covers a lot of different areas.
Exactly. So it's not really that we need to have this impact factor. We also invest in software developers sometimes, where there's a lot of coding involved. What is Vietnam very good and is a sort of science, natural sciences and coding. So it's a fairly sort of opportunistic approach to investment, and then the valuation plays a role and all that. Yeah.
There's a bit of fun outside of education. So I'll finish up with one last question. Just is where's Vietnam heading? You've touched on this quite a few times in your questions, but I just want to finish up here and the discussion on the future for Vietnam. What do you see as the future and the key things that, if crystal ball you're looking at, that you sort of would be looking at as we change and evolve, and my home, your home, it's where we live. So what do you see for Vietnam?
Vietnam's future is sort of determined, of course, by its past, right? And if you think about what's very different from Vietnam is number one, it trades about 200% of its GDP. There is no large country in the world that does that. Maybe Hong Kong, or if it's not a country, but Luxembourg or Liechtenstein is in that area. But it's the largest sort of trader in the world. Huge coastline. It has very numerous trade agreements. For European, and it's actually the main driver of a free trade zone in Asia, and if you go back to the kind of skills that I think really pronounced well, we talked about gaps, but there's also a lot of things that actually Vietnamese students, Vietnamese sort of workers do well, right? And this is these more science-oriented sort of topics, right? So and at the same time, Vietnam has a very large percentage of agricultural production, right? So outside is sort of like 40%, I think, of the economy is still sort of depending on the agricultural sector. So where does that sort of lead us, right? I do think there will be, and I think there's also government sort of ambition to maintain a large agricultural bit in the economy. It needs to improve its efficiency.
Yeah.
You know, very
efficiency,
clearly,
productivity has to change.
It has to change, right? So there's a big challenge there. Farms are far too small. Like any company, you don't see a tractor really, you know, in the farmland because they're too small to buy a tractor, right?
The communist socialist background into a capitalist it's that evolution.
So. Yeah, exactly. So that will probably maintain, but at the same time, I can see that there will be less and less manufacturing. In fact, I do think who will really win is the service industry. I don't think it will become in India where, you know, there's an outsourcing hotspot, but it's probably, you know, between tourism, computer coding, maybe discovery of new tech, sort of like research. I can imagine Vietnamese are excellent researchers, right? Very curious, driven. They have all the qualities to do so, and then sort of anchored in this sort of scientific background. I always tell that actually, you know, you can ask a bus driver, and probably a bus driver can do a derivative to you, right? If you so they're really good in sort of math and science. You know, sort of everybody, right? So not everybody, but a very large
foundation of
And so I do think there will be this sort of agricultural sector that will remain sort of fairly large in Vietnam. So it won't become a Singapore, and there will be a little bit of manufacturing. But I think that who will win in the future is really this sort of service, from hospitality to drug development to computer coding. So that's a bit of an ambitious, but I think also that would reflect sort of the ambitions of the government, where they really redirect now, I think, sort of funds to support, you know, the sort of pushing the economy towards more digital, towards really advanced technologies. And again, I think the kind of setup, the sort of mind map of Vietnamese fits well with that. So that's for me the future. You know, I mean, it's on GDP terms, it's relatively low. You know, it's like if you think about Thailand is 3 times higher. So I see there will be a jump.
GDP per capita.
Sorry, GDP per capita, right?
Vietnam's closing in on GDP, total GDP with Thailand, but per capita is a long way.
Yeah, it's 100 million people here and 60 or something?
65, yeah.
65 in Thailand. But yeah, so GDP per capita is 1/3 of Thailand. And there will be, I think, faster growth in Vietnam than in, for example, Thailand. But after that, I think there will be also the challenge of. So it's easy to grow, but then you probably need to have infrastructure. So you will have sort of massive infrastructure overhaul. You know, once you hit $8,000 per capita, and then you want to double that, you need to probably have a better infrastructure than we have now. We need to have, I think, the legal infrastructure as well, more sort of predictability of laws and the application of the laws, courts that you actually can go to. So that I think sort of immediately for the next 10 years, I think there's good growth, but then there might hit sort of these speed limiters.
So we've got the next 10 years, we've got a great runway for growth, and then things might.
Exactly. And then we have to see whether there was enough reforms in the infrastructure, in the physical infrastructure of the country, in the legal infrastructure of the country. I'm not so concerned about the educational sort of contribution to growth beyond $8,000 per capita.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Burkhard, thank you very much. It was great talking to you, and that was a great conversation looking at you, the education and sector, RMIT and your master's programs, and also a bit about sort of the economics and your own personal investment philosophy. So great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for watching today, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you.